Welcome to Scary Stories, the channel that tells you scary stories.
Welcome to Daily Dogman on Scary Stories NYC. I'm your old pal Bigfoot. We hope you had a scary holiday, but not so scary that you won't be interested in this particularly frightening 1-hour special featuring Dogman and other cryptids. Let's kick it off with a story that we've decided to call the All-Star Game Dogman. Dear Scary Stories, by the time you might read this story on your show, it'll probably be May or June, and All-Star voting for baseball should be underway. This story is about the only All-Star game I ever attended in person, which was 1996 in Philadelphia. No, I didn't see a Dogman at the game, but I did see one on the way home, or at least I think that's what it must have been. Let me start the story at the beginning. My family lived, and some of them still live, way out on the western side of Pennsylvania, about 5 hours drive from Philadelphia. For my 23rd birthday, my father had gotten me and my girlfriend tickets to see the All-Star Game, so off we went on the long drive, starting early in the morning. The National League won the game, and Mike Piazza hit a home run. We were both pretty tired on the way back, but still in good spirits. We only had about a half hour left to drive, and it was well after midnight when one of the tires blew out. I remember we were on the Rockton Mountain Highway just east of where it intersects with State Park Road, or where it becomes State Park Road if you don't make the left there. I'd never been out there so late before. There wasn't any traffic, and it was pretty dark. All I could hear was crickets as I changed the tire. Well, that and my heart beating in my chest. Something about the night scared me, and even though it was hot and I was exhausted, the weirdness of the situation had me as wired as if I had drunk 25 cups of coffee. My girlfriend was of the I can't risk breaking a nail variety, and so I didn't even ask her to help me. She complained that I was taking too long, so I tried to rush, but then I ended up slipping and hurting my finger. I realized that, as scared as I was out there alone in the dark, and as annoying as my girlfriend was being, I was still better off taking things slowly and making sure I was doing it correctly. I had only ever changed a tire in practice before, but I was really glad my father made me practice before getting me this used car. I know what you're saying. Get to the Dogman part. Okay, here's the Dogman part. I took a screen grab of where this took place and have attached it to this email. Please show that illustration during this next part. As you can see, I was parked off the side of the road on the right. The sound of the crickets was oppressively loud. Suddenly, I heard a branch breaking off in front of me to my left. Looking up, I saw something I couldn't believe. It was a really tall man walking out of the forest on the other side of the intersection. At first I thought it was a human male, but that was more than frightening enough for me. Whoever that huge, massive guy was, there was no reason for him to have been walking randomly through the woods at 2 or 3 in the morning. He was looking away from me to his left and saw that there was no traffic, so he stepped out onto the road as though he planned to cross the highway. That also set off an alarm in me, not just because he was going to be coming over to our side of the road, but also because there's really nothing past that road except one more highway for a really long time. Out there is nothing but wild animals and the Moshannon State Forest. I couldn't tell much about this guy, but he didn't look like a hunter, and my first thought was that we were in trouble. So, the big guy crossed over to the middle of the highway where there was a grass-covered separation between the western highway and the eastern one. As he reached the center, he now looked to his right to see if traffic was coming from our direction. That meant he was turning to look at us. As he did so, he of course saw my car immediately, as I had left the car lights on to help myself see a little better in the dark. And when his face turned toward us, enough of the light of the headlights hit him that I could now see this was no man. This was no human. This was something standing and walking on its hind legs, but it was not a human being. And I know you might be thinking that it was a bear, but this was not the silhouette of a bear, and this was not the face of a bear. It had backward bent legs like a dog, and the head was like a bear, but with a longer snout and pointed ears on top. Its eyes glowed a yellowy white, reflecting the car's lights. I began reciting the Lord's Prayer because it's the only one I can remember, and I worked faster, trying to get the wheel on so we could get out of danger. My hands were shaking so badly, it was hard just to get them to do what I wanted them to do, let alone do it faster. I was afraid to look up again in the direction I had seen that thing, but I forced myself to. My worst fear was realized as I saw the thing turning to walk directly toward my car. I prayed that my girlfriend had locked her door, and I turned all my attention toward getting that wheel secured. I looked up again, and the monster was still walking in our direction. I hoped the tire was fastened well enough, even though I hadn't put all the lug bolts back in. I shoved them into my pocket, and I got to work unjacking the car. I figured I had maybe another minute to work, but that monster would be upon me in another 20 seconds, even if it kept up its slow pace. I now had to wipe tears out of my eyes to see what I was doing. This was the most frightening and stressful moment of my life. Then, something happened that almost gave me a heart attack. My girlfriend leaned on the car horn hard. The bad news is that I hurt myself again as the jack slipped out from under the car. The good news is that when I looked up, the Dogman had been even more frightened by the car horn than I was, and it was now running into the forest rather than paying any more attention to us. I threw the stuff loudly in the trunk and slammed it shut, then practically dove into the driver's seat, closing the door and locking it, then checking to see if all the other doors were also locked. My girlfriend's door was still unlocked, but the other three were fine. I turned to her to kiss her and thank her for honking the horn, but was surprised to see she was angry at me. She began to loudly lecture me that she was bored and that I had taken too long changing the tire. Confused, I started the ignition and asked her if she hadn't seen what I had seen. What was I supposed to see? She asked me in a cranky voice. The darkness? You can't see the darkness. Know why? 'Cause it's not light enough, that's why. I started to explain it to her. I wondered what would happen if I told her what there really was. There was a monster. There was a Dogman. Maybe I was just lucky she didn't see what I saw. I told her it wasn't important. Now she began loudly complaining that I shouldn't bring something up if I'm not going to explain myself. This was getting me annoyed, so I looked over at her and I screamed. Not because of her, no. I screamed because of what was outside her window, walking toward us. That thing had doubled back out of the forest, and it was just a few feet away from her window. Her reaction to my scream surprised me. She screamed louder and opened the door to run away from me. But as she did so, she opened the door directly into the Dogman itself. I heard it growl, and I heard her scream, and I hit the gas hard, even though her door was open and her feet were dangling outside of the car. We squealed away, swerving all over the road until I got it back under control. I'll remember watching her in what seemed like slow motion, calmly pulling her feet back into the car and closing the door, all while we must have been going 60 miles an hour or more. Then she stared silently forward for the rest of the drive home. I looked in the mirrors but could not see Dogman following us. I delivered her to her parents' house, and as I asked if she wanted me to walk her to the door, she exited the car, again saying nothing to me. When I called her the next day, her mother said she was too sick to talk, but the day after that she seemed fine. She refused to discuss the incident with me, ever, so I've literally never heard her side of the story. I lost touch with her years back, but I bet if I found her again, she still wouldn't want to talk about it. I don't really blame her. I mean, I'm telling you the story now, but I won't tell you my name or even the town my family lives in. I don't really want people to think I'm crazy just because I saw what I still think of as the All-Star Game Dogman.
Hey, Biggity Foot. What are you doing for July 4th, yo?
I don't know, Debbie, but I do know what I'm doing the weekend after.
OMG! What's that, yo?
I'm gonna go to the Collectibles extravaganza up in Boxborough, Massachusetts, right next to Wolf Swamp, where Henry Lee Dogman lives.
Badass, yo!
I know, right?
Are you gonna, sell your stuff?
I'm gonna buy other people's old stuff and turn it into my new stuff.
Good, cause your nest could sure use some, redecorating, yo.
Come to the Collectibles extravaganza hosted by the king of pop culture himself, TV's famous Gary Summers, who appeared as an expert on pop culture on the PBS Antiques Roadshow. It's the weekend of July 6th and 7th, 2019, at the air-conditioned Regency Hotel, where Route 111 meets Route 495 in Boxborough, Massachusetts, home of the Wolf People. See you there. The Werewolf Curse at my high school, as told to Peter Bernard, read by your old pal Bigfoot. Dear Scary Stories, this happened almost a decade ago. I've lost touch with everyone in the story, but they were my friends at the time, and they were among the most popular kids in our school and our town. My family had moved in while we were all in junior year, so I was at the time grateful to have any friends at all in my new school. To have such popular kids accepting me put me in a positive state of mind and gave me some emotional space to adjust and get my schoolwork done. I guess it was because of my self-absorption that I didn't at first notice the darker side of the lives of my popular new friends. One day, there was a commotion in the schoolyard outside during our lunch period. Someone just past the fence was shouting things in our direction. My friends looked like they were all going to faint, and they ran inside. Before joining them, I stood there for a while trying to see what or who they were so frightened of. It just looked like a girl to me, a goth girl our age. She sure seemed angry, but I couldn't really understand anything she was shouting about. So, when I got back inside, I got the entire history from the others. They just spilled out the story for me. I think it made them calm down a bit to talk about it. I was pretty much the only person in the school who wouldn't already know all of this history, because I was one of the only people who moved in from out of town. That goth girl outside, let's call her Wednesday, used to actually be a member of this group or clique that I was then part of. This was back when they were in middle school, before she went goth. But freshman year in high school, her parents split up and she went all goth and emo. She started reading about spellcraft and adopted a sour attitude. Rather than looking out for their friend and helping her through her depression, the group kicked her out. And that's when things really went dark. Supposedly, the girl put a curse on them that they would each turn into werewolves, one per year, until they were all of them cursed forever. And if they had children, each succeeding generation would be cursed as they were. At this point, I burst out laughing in the lunchroom. It was like the whole place went silent. I felt like everyone was looking at me. Nobody else thought there was anything funny about this story. You know, you can't believe every goth girl that says she's putting a curse on you guys, I suggested to them. I was told to shut up, because there was more to this story. Back when this all first happened, there was a kid named Cliff in the group. A few days after they had all gotten cursed, he came into school one morning in really bad shape. His hair was messed up, and he looked as though he had been crying. When he was asked what was wrong, he said that both his pets had died the night before, but he didn't want to talk about it. He was clearly in grief and possibly in shock, so everyone tried to give him some space that day. Then, the next day, when he didn't come in at all, nobody was really very surprised. After a few days, they noticed that all his social media accounts were closed, as well as those of his family members that they knew. The family's phones were all turned off, and their house was empty. This happened really fast, and nobody ever found out what happened to any of them. So, life went on, and although it was weird what happened, or didn't happen, to Cliff, things sort of returned to normal by sophomore year. That is, until Mary Ann had her episode. It was supposedly in girls' gym class. One of the other girls made fun of Mary Ann for having hairy legs. Mary Ann thought she had shaved that morning, so she was shocked to find that she actually did have hairy legs. Other girls joined in the taunting, and apparently Mary Ann had a bit of a freak out. One of the kids telling me the story described it as a Hulk out. Apparently, she started screaming things at the girls with such passion that it devolved into animal-like noises and something like a howl. This kid Bill told me he saw the tail end of a bunch of girls screaming and running out of the gym in their shorts. It was quite memorable, he told me with a grin. He didn't see Marianne, but some of the other girls were crying and saying she had turned into a monster right in front of them. So the next thing you know, Marianne's family also moved out of town, and by this point, nobody was laughing at the goth girl's curse anymore. Her family had moved out of town as well, and junior year had been going in a sort of a normal and boring way, so people were hoping that the worst was over. None of the kids had freaked out or hulked out, and no families had mysteriously moved out of town overnight. The horror was starting to recede into the past like a bad dream, until that day when Wednesday the goth girl came back to town. Now they each wondered who would be targeted next. I had an idea and I presented it to them. Why not invite Wednesday back into the group? If she lived in another town, then she wouldn't actually be around all that often anyway, so what would it hurt? And it might heal her hurt feelings. Well, it wasn't like they thought my idea was crazy. It was more like they acted as though I had never even said it. They just went back to talking about how afraid they were. Nobody was looking for a way out. So anyway, that kid Bill used to live a couple of blocks away from me, so we would walk home after school together. On that day, we took a shortcut near a patch of woods because he wanted to get home as quickly as possible. I didn't blame the guy, but all the same, I tried to give him a pep talk and continued to lobby for my idea of giving the goth girl a second chance in the group. It was like I wasn't saying anything at all, though. He was so lost in his misery and worry and fear. So, as we passed by the woods, Bill's whole body sort of catches and he gets all tight. Then he jerks around into several weird positions. He was clearly in some kind of pain, but I couldn't understand what was happening to him. I took a few steps back to get a better view, and also so that I didn't accidentally get hit by his arms and head, which were sort of flailing about. The dude was growing hair all over his body, just like in the story of Marianne in the gym. Except this, I was watching with my own eyes. I backed up, and as I did so, I saw figures moving through the woods, past my contorting friend. Dark figures emerging from the woods. They looked like werewolves from the movies. They appeared to be animals, as they were entirely covered in fur or hair and did not wear clothes like people. They walked upright like humans, though. They had the long ears and the long snout and dark eyes, which I could not make out at all. They seemed to be focused on Bill, watching him transform. I understood then that he was going to end up looking the same as the others. That is when I literally backed up into someone standing behind me, and I screamed and jumped up in the air. When I turned around, it was that goth girl. She was standing right there. I didn't know what to do, but before I could even catch my breath, she looked at me, pointed away, and said one word: "Go." I babbled like a fool, telling her that she could hang with me if she wanted, and that I had asked the others to let her back in the group, but she interrupted me and once more said that one word: "Go." So I went, and I didn't hang with those kids anymore. Nobody faulted me for it, not even that group. They were cursed. They knew it, the school knew it, and now I knew it too. Within 4 years, all of their families were living elsewhere, and nobody really knew where elsewhere. Those things looked like what we call Dogman, but I believe I was looking at werewolves. Were they always in that form? Or did they turn back and forth like in the movies? Did they always travel with that goth girl? Did she control them somehow? I have a lot of questions, but I've never had any inclination to pursue finding any answers. I figure the less I know, the safer I and my loved ones will be. It's just not worth knowing. Let them keep their secrets. And another life lesson I learned that year was this: always be nice to goth girls. We got a good email earlier today about a Dogman encounter in Dodgeville, Wisconsin, and it's called The Beast of Bray Street, as told to Peter Bernard, read by your old pal Bigfoot. Dear Scary Stories. First of all, I want to point out that the title is not a typo. This did not happen on Bray Road, but actually on Bray Street in Wisconsin. I do not live in that area, but was driving through to visit a friend who lives a few miles away. It was dark, and I had 2 girls in the car with me, so as a joke, I decided to cut down Bray Street, telling them it was where a real werewolf had been seen back in the 1990s. They were pretty sure I was joking, but not absolutely sure, and as we got to the block, they were kind of nervous and asking me not to drive down it. The most amazing thing was, when we passed this one house with a 2nd floor deck outside, we saw what looked like a really giant dog sitting there. It came almost up to the deck, even sitting down. I was staring as hard as I could, trying to get a better look, but the thing was in shadow, and we could really only see it in silhouette. The girls were screaming for me to drive, and that was distracting as well. I was probably as scared as they were, since I really had been joking, and I hadn't expected to see a monster down that suburban block, obviously. So then the next thing you know, this thing stands up and starts walking toward us. Yes, walking on its hind legs. We did not get a really good look at the thing, but it didn't seem to be a bear, and it didn't seem to be a Sasquatch. It really appeared to be an immense dog, capable of bipedal motion. My judgment can hardly be considered scientific, obviously, since it was dark, and I was stunned by what I was seeing. But it sure seemed real. I don't know the people who live on that block. Maybe some of them make movie monsters for a living or as a hobby. I'm not saying it couldn't have been a prank or a joke, but I am saying that whatever it was looked very real in the darkness and scared the living daylights out of me and those 2 girls. Maybe the fear the girls were feeling sort of generated a tulpa of the monster where I had told them to expect to see it? Maybe our imagination projected the monster out into reality? The only explanation I know is not true is that we imagined it, because we couldn't all 3 of us have imagined the exact same thing. If anyone knows any movie effects guys who live over there, please let me know, okay? Because if that's not the answer, then I guess I saw the Beast of Bray Street. And now for another Dogman story told to you by Madeline Starr.
I dream of Dogman. As told to Peter Bernard. Read by Madeline Starr. Sometimes a dream can seem real, because maybe it is. Before I even begin, I want to point out that although this narrative starts out talking about weird dreams I had, the main story is about the stuff that happened to me in real life after the dreams. So be patient, because it won't make any sense unless I describe the dreams first. When I was a teenager, my family would drive south each winter to visit relatives. In my parents' minds, we were avoiding the cold weather in New York City, but actually Tennessee gets just about as cold as New York, so I don't think they thought it through very clearly. My 2 female cousins would take me hiking, which was really just wandering around the cedars of Lebanon State Park, trying to avoid our respective parents. Independence is so important to you when you're a teenager that you're willing to freeze your butt off all day just to get a little of it. My brother mostly stayed back in the house watching our cousin's VHS video collection. I think this was around the time DVDs had just come out, but the people we knew were still mostly watching VHS tapes. That year, my brother was on a werewolf kick, and it seemed like every time I was in the house, he was watching something like Wolfen or The Howling or one of those kinds of horror movies. Then one night, I had this weird dream. In the dream, I was out in the forest, but I wasn't hiking. I was alone and off trail. I felt at home in the bushes and moved through them with ease and grace. I felt super powerful and strong, like I could do anything I put my mind to, even impossible things. I came out of the brush into a clearing. I knew exactly where I was. It was the intersection of Cedar Forest Road and Sioux Warren Trail. I was just off the road looking down the trail in the direction of Hurricane Creek. Just then, I saw a very familiar car driving up. It was my parents' car. I saw my mother driving and my father in the passenger seat. Studying the scene a little more closely, I could swear I saw my 2 female cousins sitting in the back, along with me. I stepped all the way out of the brush to get a better look at the car, which was now idling by the stop sign. Everyone in the car made eye contact with me, and then they all screamed in horror. That's when I woke up, my heart beating fast like I had been running a marathon. It was the most real-seeming dream I had ever lived through. When I went down to breakfast and my brother was watching yet another werewolf picture on TV, I realized he had probably inspired my nightmare. I asked him if he had any comedies on that VHS pile he could put on, and he said he was running Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein next. That one's got Lon Chaney Jr. in it as the Wolfman, he told me excitedly. Fine. That meant another day of hiking for me. I think I had that dream 2 more times. It was getting so I had a hard time falling asleep at night because I didn't want to deal with the dream. I was in the forest in the snow. I see my family in the car and they are all terrified of me. Why are they afraid of me? And how can I be me but also in the car? One night the dream started and I saw my family's car pull up. Instead of revealing myself this time, I hid in the bushes and watched. When they drove by, I followed them. I knew I could run as fast as I wanted to. I had outrun deer while hunting in previous dreams. I was an apex predator. When we all arrived at my cousin's house, I hid behind a tree, watching them go inside. I stayed up until night observing them, observing myself, eating dinner, then watching TV, then going to bed. After I saw myself in bed, I wandered closer to the house. It was a bright moon out, but no other illumination. As I got to my bedroom window and saw myself sleeping there, I noticed I could also see my own moonlit reflection in the window. But I didn't look like me. I looked like one of the werewolves from my brother's movies. Again, I woke with a start, my head beating like a machine gun. This time I got up quickly and pulled my window shades down. In the dream, I had just looked through that window and seen myself. I didn't want to look out. I didn't want to see what was outside. I didn't want to know. Maybe it was just a dream, but I just didn't want to find out. That morning at breakfast, I started asking my parents when we were going home, and my uncle got kind of insulted. That led to this whole thing, and so my cousins and I split for the forest without even finishing our breakfasts. We got some food at a diner on the way to the state park, and then went back again for lunch to warm up. We had no plans, nothing to do, but we wanted to avoid drama and conflict, so we planned on staying out all day. That evening, we were starting to wander through the park back toward home when we saw my parents' car pulling up. We figured we were going to get lectured, but instead they were apologetic about the conflict earlier in the day and said they'd been driving around looking for us for hours. They offered to take us to the movies, so we hopped in and we drove off. That's when I got the strangest feeling of déjà vu. I looked outside and realized we were driving over Hurricane Creek. That meant we were on Sioux Warren Trail, heading toward... There it was, the stop sign. That meant this was the moment from my dream. I looked across the road and I saw it before everyone else. I saw a dog's head glaring back at me from the bushes. I screamed at the top of my lungs and pointed. Everyone else now looked also as a giant dog walked out of the bushes on her hind legs and stood there staring at us intently. She was definitely female. She had teats like a mother dog, but she had to have been 7 feet tall. Her hair was dark and her eyes were orange-yellow. She didn't seem like a natural creature. She seemed like a demon covered in fur. But when she looked at me, she looked so confused and sad. I knew why. "Drive," I shouted. Then I shouted it again and again and again. To get past the creature, my mother would have to drive closer to it, then turn past it. There was no other way. It was either that or drive backwards down the trail for miles. So my mom hit the gas and we accelerated toward the creature, toward my nightmare. I don't know what happened next because I fainted flat away. We left the next morning. My parents and I were pretty shaken up and the mood in the house had changed. My uncle thought we were making up the Dogman story as an excuse, so there was even more unnecessary drama. It was just time to go. In all the years since then, I've never had a dream anything like that ever again. I have no explanation for what it was that happened. I dreamed that I was the entity that frightened myself. And no matter how confused or sad I was in my dreams, I was still terrified of the female werewolf when I saw her at the crossroads. I would like to say that the dream taught me not to fear and taught me to treat even frightening entities as I would want them to treat me. And yet, I think the lesson I took away from it was more like, even evil creatures have feelings. But it's not a kind of awareness that makes you feel better about life or that causes you to change your behavior. Just because I vividly experienced what it feels like to be a monstrous beast while in my dreams didn't make the beast any less monstrous when I encountered her again in my waking state. We still have to battle the evils in our lives, but now I do so sadly, understanding on a deep level that even those who mean to do me harm or destroy me are real people with the same exact feelings that I have. If you get threatened by a dogman, don't sympathize with him or her because of what I've told you. Yes, I know that they are conscious, thinking people just like us, but they are still evil, and they won't hesitate to take you out in a second if you give them a chance. Empathize with them, respect them, avoid them if you can. But if you have to defend yourself, do it unquestioningly. Do it before they do something to you. Don't go away. We've got an all-new tale about a largely, previously undocumented mammalian cryptid from New York City. The Rat Man. As told to Peter Bernard, read by Madeline Starr. I've been living on the Upper West Side of Manhattan since the 1970s, when I was in my early 20s. It was, back then, a neighborhood of lovely, large apartments built for doctors and lawyers which had fallen on hard times. The buildings, which were by then cheap to live in, had fallen into disrepair. Crime was rampant. Garbage blew down the streets and rats roamed openly. Giant men dressed as ladies ran into traffic, working their illegal trade right on Broadway in front of McDonald's. I got a room a block away from Broadway in a formerly grand apartment which had been altered into many smaller rooms through the use of cheap plaster walls. Over the years, people moved out and I got better work. I took over more of the rent and more of the space. Eventually, by the late 1980s, one of my roommates transferred the lease into my name, which was easier to do back then than now. And the apartment has been entirely mine since then. I removed most of the new walls and restored some of the former glory of the place. By the 1990s, the neighborhood was hip and expensive again. Seinfeld set a sitcom there. Thanks to rent control, the amount I paid each month had stayed roughly at the 1980s rate, right up through the 21st century. When new neighbors moving in upstairs a few years ago told me what they were paying, I was shocked. There was no way I could afford to pay that much. I realized how lucky I was to have that place. I was right on the ground floor with a window onto a relatively quiet side street. Even inside, I always felt like I was part of the neighborhood because I got used to who would walk by and when they would do it. If I was watching TV or reading by the window at night, I'd be frequently interrupted by the hellos of neighbors. I retired from my career, and I expected to settle into my golden years relaxing and looking out the window onto my beloved neighborhood. Then my friendly, sweet landlord died. The building was taken over by a company that the New York Daily News described as New York's new evil mega landlord. They set up a table in our lobby and made us line up to be interrogated about why we wanted to live in the building. Then they fingerprinted and photographed us like criminals. We were issued photo ID cards that we had to use in conjunction with a new box they had installed on our front door. Now they would have information about when we went out or stayed home along with security video. Why did they need this? They installed alarms on doors that didn't need them, and the alarms would go off all times of the day and night. None of the tenants had keys to turn the incredibly loud sirens off, and the management company had moved our superintendent to a different building. We would have to call management and beg them to come turn the alarms off, which would take hours every time. Then one snowy morning, I got up and made coffee, ready to settle into my window seat and greet the neighbors. What I saw really shocked me. The snow was piled up outside the window so high I couldn't see out. Throwing on my overcoat and galoshes, I ran outside to see how much it had snowed during the night that it should cover my window. It turned out that the sidewalk had been shoveled, but for some reason, all the snow had been deliberately piled in front of my window. I went back inside to call the management office and noticed that the bottom of the wall on the side where they had piled the snow was all stained wet and leaking. The place smelled bad, like mildew, but also something terrible mixed in. I couldn't place it, but it was an awful smell. When I finally got through to one of the building managers, he told me it probably smelled bad because of all the dead rats rotting in our basement. This shocked me, but he wasn't done. He told me the building was dangerous for an old lady like me to live in, and that if he were me, he'd have already moved out. That was his answer to me. It's even worse than you're saying, so move out. I hung up and sat there shaking my head for a while. So many years of peace in this place. I guess I lived a few years too long, I said to myself. Then the lights went out and the TV turned off. It was a bright morning and I could still see clearly in the light that came through my snow-covered window. I wondered if this was just my apartment or the entire building, or maybe a city-wide blackout. Our super usually visited in the morning. He might even have turned the power off for some reason himself. I resolved to go to the basement and see what I could see. There was a narrow, creepy staircase next to the elevator that led from the lobby down to the basement. When I got to the bottom, there was one of those alarmed doors blocking my way. I pushed on it anyway, and it opened easily and quietly. Maybe the lock and alarm worked electrically and opened because the electricity was off? I'm not sure. Maybe it was just left open. I went inside and immediately splashed ice-cold water up onto my legs. The entire basement was flooded with about an inch of water down to maybe a quarter of an inch in some shallower areas. I could see how unevenly the concrete floor had been put down, some parts deep below the water and some forming islands above the new sea level down there. I called out our super's name. I heard no response other than the echoing of my voice. Stepping gingerly, I took a few steps toward the laundry room. Kerplunk, kerplunk, kerplunk. I called out the super's name again, and this time I heard something moving in the water in the laundry room. Quickly, I jogged over to the laundry room door and peered inside. The flooding was everywhere, in this room as well, but the liquid had a thicker and darker quality to it. I stared for a while in the dim light until I realized it was a deep crimson red. Something splashed in the darkness and I forgot about the water. Looking up, I saw the dark silhouette of a man taller than myself, but he was the strangest shaped man I'd ever seen. My eyes were telling my brain what his silhouette looked like, and yet my brain was not making any sense out of it. Then suddenly the overhead lights came back on and one of the dryers began turning again. I squinted in shock as my eyes readjusted to the harsh fluorescent brightness. That was not a man standing in front of me. That was a monster. Although as large as a linebacker or a fireman, this was some sort of animal, covered in gray fur. My first impression had been that it was standing on its hind legs, but now in the light I could see that it was squatting on its hind legs. Its body was essentially that of a giant rat, reared up with its claws in front of it in a defensive or attack pose. It had a long nose like a dog, but its nose and whiskers twitched ridiculously and sickeningly. I could hear it breathing, trying to understand me by my scent, and I realized the source of the terrible smell. No, not the monster, but the thing on the floor in front of it, the formerly living thing laying there in that crimson pool. I don't even know what it had been in life, maybe a stray, maybe somebody's pet. I felt very ill and the room swayed. The giant, hideous abomination hissed at me in a threatening way, and I took a quick step backward. Kerplunk! It took advantage of my retreat to turn around and somehow throw itself through a crack in the bottom of the wall that was far too small for even me to fit through, let alone something of his size. Even though the monster was gone, I felt sick. I ran for the stairs to escape the basement, and I ran right into the super. I explained the entire thing to him in a panicked way, and he just acted like I was crazy. That was the last straw, and I gave up. If they wanted me to leave, I would leave. I moved in with my daughter and her husband in Queens. They don't like having me here, and I don't like being a burden on them. I sit in my new window in my new room, but it's on the second floor and overlooks a one-way dead end that very few people ever have reason to walk or drive down. But I'm grateful to be here, and I know I'm lucky. The suburbs don't have a lot of things that the city has. Most of that makes me sad. But suburban people don't have giant man-sized rats in their basements. And that part makes me glad.
Do you have a scary story you want us to read on the show? Just call our voicemail hotline, 804-LIST-SCARY. That's 804-537-2279. And now for something completely scary.
Bigfoot doll came to life, as told to Peter Bernard, read by Retribution. Dear Scary Stories, this story happened back in the mid-1990s. I was a teenager and lived with my parents and my younger brother, who we can call Dilbert. One day, Dilbert had this Harry and the Hendersons Bigfoot doll. It was used when he got it, and I never really asked how or why he got it. I assumed it was at a yard sale since my mother was always going to those. He and I were both into Bigfoot back then, so I guessed that must be why he got it. I had never seen either the movie or the TV version of Harry and the Hendersons, but I figured my brother must have been a fan. I think the doll was around 3 feet tall, or it would have been if it could have stood up. It was too floppy to do that, though. I noticed it had a white ring on its back, so I pulled it. But if the thing was supposed to be able to talk, that function was already broken by that point. It would make a noise like something was trying to do something inside it, and then the string would pull itself back in. But if that Bigfoot doll was talking, it was probably more along the lines of EVPs by that point. It was almost like he had brought home the remains of a doll, more than a doll itself. But it was Bigfoot, and it was weird looking, so my attention was drawn to it. I kept all my questions in my head, though, and I don't recall actually talking to my brother about it at all back then. It wasn't long after he got it that he came to me, acting panicked one day. He said that the doll would get up and walk around his room, but that when he would go to his door to call me or our parents to his room to see, the doll would flop to the floor and stop moving. It was like it only wanted him to see that it could walk. I thought he was joking. I didn't really think he could be serious, but his acting skills had been improving lately, and his performance was quite convincing. He really seemed shaken up by this. I asked him, why should I believe him? Dilbert pulled out an 8x10 glossy of a photo. I took it from him and examined it, and I noticed that it was a picture of Dilbert's room, or more specifically, the floor of his room. And, yes, just off-center toward the back of the rug was the Bigfoot doll. And it was standing up. It might possibly have been walking. I knew the doll couldn't stand on its own, so I asked him what he leaned the Bigfoot against. He acted all wide-eyed and innocent and said he didn't know what I meant. I told him that he had to have leaned the Bigfoot against something to make it stand up, or maybe he dangled it from a string to make it appear upright. I wanted to know how he pulled it off. He insisted he didn't do any of those things, and that he was terrified of his haunted Harry and the Hendersons doll. I asked him what he wanted me to do about it, and so somehow I ended up taking the doll to keep in my room. Why I didn't immediately throw it out, I don't remember. Maybe I was just emotionally exhausted from having to argue about something so unimportant as a Sasquatch plush doll that didn't even talk anymore. So the way I remember it was that the very first night the doll was in the room, this traumatic event occurred. It's possible that it was a couple of nights later though. I didn't keep a diary or anything, and this was over 20 years ago, but anyway, soon after taking the doll into my room, I was awakened in the middle of the night by something choking me. I thought I was tangled in my bed sheets, but when I reached up around my throat, I felt something completely unexpected. Fur and cloth. Opening my eyes, I saw the Harry and the Hendersons doll, its face inches from mine, grimacing at me. Its hands were at my throat. They shouldn't have been as large as they were. The doll shouldn't have been able to strangle me, yet this one was doing just that. It was much more of a struggle than it should possibly have been, but I did eventually manage to pull the creature, or whatever it was, off of my throat. The second it was loose from my neck, the entire thing went limp and became just a doll again. I threw it away from me onto the floor like it was a bug or a rat or something. I felt like screaming, but then I got to my feet and turned on the room light. With the darkness gone and my harsh bright overhead lights on, the thing didn't appear menacing any longer. Now it looked like a stupid broken doll laying on my floor with its face in the rug and its butt in the air. Nothing very threatening about that. I put on my bathrobe and slippers, then marched that doll downstairs and outside to the garbage can. When I got back upstairs, Dilbert was waiting up for me in my room. He wanted to know what happened, and so, quietly, I told him that I now believed him, that the doll really was haunted. I told him how it tried to strangle me, and then I threw it out. His eyes grew increasingly wider as I went on, and by the end he had both hands over his mouth. Trying desperately not to laugh out loud and wake our parents, I asked him what was so funny, and he said that I must have had one of those sleep paralysis episodes. I must have just imagined that the doll attacked me because it must have been part of a waking dream. I asked him why he didn't believe me, and he finally let me know that the photo he showed me was faked. I got really angry at him because he had sworn to me that he didn't prop the doll up against anything and he didn't dangle it from a string. I didn't, he insisted. I faked it in Photoshop. I had heard of Photoshop, but I hadn't actually used it yet back in those days. My brother was an early adapter to graphics and animation programs on the computer, whereas I had no interest in it until this century. I'm guessing that if I saw the Harry and the Hendersons photo again today, I might have spotted that it was done in Photoshop. But at that time, my eye was unable to spot the deception. I had the idea that it wasn't real, but I never suspected he was actually superimposing the doll on the background. I was impressed that he was able to pull it off more than I was annoyed by the prank. So I went to bed assuming that he had been right and that it was all sleep paralysis. It seemed pretty funny to me that I had thrown Bigfoot in the trash just because I had a bad dream. However, after I had a chance to sleep on it, I realized that the Sasquatch doll was on my side of the room, on top of me, when I woke up. before I went to sleep, I had left it on the top of my dresser on the other side of the room. How could it have crossed the room on its own as a result of my sleep paralysis? It seems to me that either someone else, like maybe my brother, was in my room and moved the doll on top of me, or else something paranormal happened that night. And even if he put the doll on top of me while I slept, that still doesn't explain the feeling of being strangled that I felt. That doll's arms and hands weren't long or large enough to have had that effect on me. So to this day, Dilbert makes fun of me for the time I thought Harry the Bigfoot was trying to suffocate me. He tells the story to everyone about my supposed sleep paralysis incident, and I don't say anything. I just listen. But internally, I'm not so sure about what happened that night. And I'll tell you another thing too. I have no regrets about throwing out the Bigfoot doll that came to life. And now, get ready for an all-new, completely uncensored, slightly bloody, and absolutely terrifying new Dogman story. Oh wait, YouTube won't allow me to tell you stories like that on this channel. If you want to hear that, you're going to have to go to peterbernard.com and sign up for our paid subscribers club. You can choose any price you can afford for a 1-month subscription, and then every weekend we tell you a story YouTube would never allow us to tell you on this channel. See you this Sunday for an all-new, very scary, completely uncensored Dogman story.
If you enjoyed this, please click like or consider subscribing. Remember to click the bell icon or you won't get notifications. If you want to listen to Bigfoot's secret uncensored story each Sunday, just go to peterbernard.com and become a paid subscriber. See you tomorrow. Same dog time, same dog channel.
Come back for more scary stories.